If England was a tiny village of just 200 people, then either 2 or 3 of those people would have the surname Smith. 66 of them would live in households with a dog, and 28 of them would be vegetarian. And according to figures published by the charity Shelter last year, 1 person in our village of 200 would be homeless, would be sleeping rough, or would be in temporary accommodation of some kind. And of course, just 1 person not having a safe place to call home is a tragedy. So if we scale that up across the UK, across the world, it is heartbreaking to think of the number of people experiencing homelessness, or, especially with the cost of living crisis, anxious that they might soon be experiencing homelessness. And each year, 50 people in our village of 200 would experience a mental health problem of some kind. It's very likely that our 1 person experiencing homelessness would be among those 50. It's hard to say whether the stresses, physical and emotional, of being homeless can lead to mental health issues, or whether mental health issues can lead to someone being made homeless. Most likely it's a bit of both. So this year, this Homeless Sunday, our theme is homelessness and mental health. Homeless Sunday is marked every year on the Sunday closest to the 10th of October. The 10th of October is also World Mental Health Day. So this year, Housing Justice thought that they would join the dots and help us to think about those who are struggling both with their mental health and also with finding a safe place to live. As Christians, we remember that Jesus said that he came to bring life in all its fullness. And we have to believe that he was thinking about both physical and mental well-being, and about that basic human requirement of having a safe place to rest, to grow, to go back to at the end of the day. So what might be the role of the church in offering this abundant life, and especially to those who are struggling with homelessness and with their mental health? Today we heard a passage from Luke's Gospel. You might like to have Luke chapter 17 verses 11 to 19 open in front of you. Jesus was gradually making his way towards Jerusalem, and he came across 10 men on the outskirts of a village who cried out to him for mercy. The Bible describes these 10 men as lepers. But what the Bible calls leprosy isn't necessarily Hansen's disease, what we would call leprosy today. Instead, the Bible uses the word leprosy to describe a number of different skin conditions. And in the Old Testament especially, they were very aware of how dangerous these skin conditions could be and how easily they were spread. So if you had one of these diseases, you were considered unclean. If you entered an infected house, you had to bathe afterwards. Any infected fabrics had to be burnt. And most damagingly, if you were living with one of these diseases, then you were cast out of mainstream society. Leviticus 13 said that anyone with one of these diseases must live outside the town, wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, and cry out, "Unclean, unclean," so that everybody knew to keep their distance. These 10 men in our story today knew what it was to live on the fringes of society. Of course, they had to live physically on the fringes, in the margins, the outskirts of the village, at a safe distance from everyone else. But there are plenty of people living among us, people in our churches, people watching this video now who are living on the fringes in all sorts of other ways. Homelessness and poor mental health can both push people to the margins, whether that's because of loneliness or discrimination or the difficulty of accessing essential services. The good news for the 10 men in our story was that what the Bible calls leprosy wasn't necessarily a permanent condition. You could recover, and if you did, there were purification rites that you had to go through to re-enter society. If you want to, you can read all about them in Leviticus chapter 14. I won't go through all of them in detail because they're quite complicated, but some of them make a lot of sense. These 10 men would have been required to wash and shave off their hair and wash their clothes, and then they'd be allowed back into the village, but they'd have to stay outside the houses for another 7 days. And after those 7 days, they would wash and shave their hair and wash their clothes again. It's a little bit reminiscent of the washing and the hand sanitizer and the periods of isolation that became hallmarks of COVID. And you can almost imagine those 10 men watching the 7 days tick down on their NHS app. Other bits of the purification ritual make a bit less sense. There's something about having to kill a bird over some fresh water in a clay pot. But it's interesting that the person in charge of the ritual and the person in charge of confirming that the lepers had in fact been healed was the priest. So when Jesus encountered these 10 men, when they asked him for mercy, when he decided that he would offer them a route back into mainstream society, what he did was send them off to the priest. Today, the role of the church in healthcare has changed somewhat. But it's still an interesting and a challenging thought to know that when Jesus saw these 10 men, when he had mercy on them, he sent them off to see the priest. The church still has a vital role to play in being present on the margins of society, being among those who have been excluded for any reason, finding out what they need, what they want, offering them a path back to life in all its fullness. But all of that sounds very one way, and that's not really the way that Jesus operated. In this story, it's Jesus offering the 10 men healing. But in Matthew and Mark's Gospels, we're told that Jesus went to the house of someone called Simon the leper to have dinner. That's where Jesus was when a woman came and scandalously anointed him with some very expensive perfume. We don't know much at all about Simon's story, although we assume he must have recovered from his disease to be hosting a dinner party in Bethany. Perhaps it was Jesus who healed Simon. But at the point in the story when we meet him, it's Jesus who is receiving from Simon. Simon who is offering hospitality. Jesus who is receiving a meal from him. With little children, sometimes we have to teach them that giving gifts is just as exciting as receiving them. I find with adults, it's often the other way around. It makes us feel good to be able to help other people. And although we don't often like to think of it this way, it's also quite a powerful position. It leaves us feeling much more vulnerable to be willing to receive help from other people. Jesus was willing to be vulnerable in this way, to receive help from others, including people like Simon and Zacchaeus and Mary Magdalene, who knew what life was like on the fringes of society. I wonder how the priest found it when these 10 men appeared, having been miraculously healed. I wonder if he was overjoyed. I wonder if a part of him felt guilty about having played a part in pushing them into the outskirts of the village, making them wear torn clothes, keep their hair unkempt and shout, "Unclean, unclean." I wonder if he was willing to sit with them and listen to their experiences on the margins and learn from them. Housing Justice, who produce these and other resources for Homeless Sunday every year, work hard to raise funds and awareness to alleviate homelessness. Many of the people that they work with are struggling not just with finding a safe place to live, but with their mental health as well. One of the projects that Housing Justice runs is a hosting project, where people with spare rooms offer those rooms to people who would otherwise have no entitlement to housing, people like destitute asylum seekers. My husband and I are registered as hosts, but we've always lived in too tiny a flat or too far away from London to be much help. But people I've spoken to who have acted as hosts have talked about that sense of mutuality, how they thought that they were offering something good to something in need. They thought that they were being the ones to give, but in fact that they have received great blessings from their guests, kindness and wisdom and insights, especially from life on the margins. You can visit housingjustice.org.uk to find out lots more about what Housing Justice do, to make a donation, and for more Homeless Sunday resources, which this year includes resources for mental health first aid. You can also find out lots more about becoming a host if that's something you might be able to offer. So this Homeless Sunday, let us join Jesus on the margins, with those who need to receive the good news about life in all its fullness. May each of us realise that we have something to give, but also much to receive. And may we be carriers of God's peace, healing, and love. Amen.